What's up, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of Mr. Clarke After Dark, and this is episode 101. Yes, finally, I've gone to 100 episodes. I feel like I've always kind of been told not to think about any sort of milestones because, again, there is no milestone, and to kind of get cheesy here to start in lifelong learning. I do think that hopefully I've gotten a little bit better at it in the course of doing 100 of these over the past 2 years now. It was actually May of 2023 that I recorded my first episode, even though I didn't actually launch until the September with Hillary Morgan. I remember the first question I ever asked to someone on this podcast, if you go back to listen to episode one, was, where did you grow up? So I'm hoping that the questions have gotten a little bit more, um, maybe a bit higher minded, and also a few fun conversations there throughout. But to do a solo one here for episode 101, I kind of like the idea of like, what is Mr. Clarke After Dark 101? What would you, if you had to take, if you're given a course, God forbid, where you had to listen to all 100 episodes and kind of give your main takeaways? That's kind of what I wanted to do here today. I really put in a lot of intention, I guess, to what are some of the specific points and takeaways that might seem obvious to some, but also kind of deflect against some of the narratives that we see in education in terms of what does a good teacher look like? What are some of the things that teachers are often thinking but aren't allowed to say? I will obviously not be attacking any colleagues in this episode. That's never my intent. That's never my goal. Um, but I do think there are some things that uh, are some obvious takeaways for teachers. And I think coming into education, it's personally, I was so inspired by like professors and teachers that I had. And I'm like, like I'm gonna make a difference. I'm gonna be the one that comes into the classroom and I want to learn from my other teachers around me. And I think in a weird way, teachers have been taught to be closed off. And what I mean by that is I remember my first couple of years subbing, and maybe this is just kind of the green energy I was giving off at the time, is I would always ask teachers, like, oh, like what's your number one tip for lesson planning? It was probably actually super annoying, because they're trying to get to their lunch supervision. But I do think that teachers need to stop being so humble. I think that's lesson number one, is they need to put themselves out there more. I do think that teachers are almost taught to hide their expertise kind of behind their classroom walls. I think we're constantly told that like nobody really knows what they're doing and you have to make teaching your own. And it's like, well, no, some of us newer teachers, we want to learn from you. And in having a conversation with another professor recently, I think him and I were discussing, do teachers actually have an obligation to start to create content and become more involved in the online creator world? What I will say is education podcasts definitely do not have the sexiest, I guess, appeal, if that makes sense. It's probably poor wording, but in a few education and almost all of the education podcasts that I've come across, I would say with the exception of Huberman Lab, really, maybe Modern Wisdom. Those are two that I frequent the most. Those are also very popular podcasts. And those are kind of education related, but they're not actually about the K to 12 system. I think the second that you start hearing a podcast about the K to 12 system, there's almost this immediate eye roll of like, oh, like this guy's gonna just talk about like the educationisms of like burnout and fatigue and marking strategies. And honestly, some sort of encapsulation of every single boring PD session that teachers have ever been forced to attend. And I totally get that. Even myself, I've had times where I've had guests on and I'll be thinking like, okay, see what you're saying about your topic, but I don't see the applicability still. And even though I've tried to in the moment kind of tease that out with those guests at those times, and again, and it's never, I don't think that's being done deliberately. I think that from a if you're giving PD perspective, there is a genuine effort to try to solve a problem that is in education, and that this could be a way to solve some of those crazy problems that we have. And again, even as I'm saying crazy problems, some of these problems are always very ill conceived or ill defined. So I mean, an ill defined problem is going to be very difficult to solve. So yeah, I think the spirit of this podcast has always been to it's always been conducted through the belief that teachers have the answers to teachers' problems. I think if we've got 1,000 problems, there's probably 1,000 different teachers that are solving each problem a different way, and that's kind of the goal in trying to produce this body of knowledge or this library for educators to kind of feel like, you know what, I can actually sit down and listen to two people have a conversation on a podcast where I don't feel like I'm being talked down to. I don't feel like I'm part of that conversation, and I hope that those who do listen to this podcast do feel like they are part of a conversation. With that being said, I think seeing things like the Teachers Off Duty podcast and people like Principal Lamb and Educator Andrea, like there are people in education who have massive followings, and I think there is clearly a hunger still for, again, sometimes humorous, hopefully often humorous, as I think most things can be talked about in a way that doesn't have to be as serious as it um, necessarily needs to be at all times. But I do think seeing the success of other teaching platforms does suggest that there is a want for problem solving. There's a want to understand the uniqueness and like I guess to kind of throw a fancy word, like the idiosyncrasies of education specifically. I know a lot of times there's people that will compare teaching to nursing and all these kind of other professions where I think the more that we start to compare, the more that we actually lose the merit in the individuality of what we discuss within our profession. So that could be actually kind of a great segue to my next point about imposter syndrome. Yes, shout out Peter Pereno for always making fun of me for talking about imposter syndrome on the show. But yeah, to kind of wrap that first one off, I think like teachers need to be less humble. And I think they need to be okay with saying, you know what, there are things you can do better. And not even from like an evaluation standpoint, it's like, you might hear that you have to do X, Y, and Z, but this is how I actually do A, B, and C. And it kind of actually, I think sometimes mentors are scared or like they don't want to tell you how to teach, which I also understand. But at the same time, I think there needs to be more people contributing to the foundation of teachers rather than like, again, if you ask me how to build a house right now, that would house would probably be falling apart immediately. I don't know how to pour a foundation. I don't know how to do it properly, but a lot of other teachers have learned how to do it. So if they do not actually maybe give their advice or their expertise in trying to build that foundation for you, I mean, you might go through teaching and not even realizing that your foundation is falling apart, which is, I guess, the way I think of like a powerful metaphor for actually trying to have new teachers feel competent in the classroom. I think it's very common for teachers to feel incompetent and almost kind of like reinforce that you are incompetent, which is um I think leading for a lot of teachers to kind of feel like they need to seek reassurance more. But so yeah, do teachers have an obligation to be involved in content creation? I know that the people that I've kind of been involved with in the podcast that produce podcasts or produce content or write books, I love it. And I obviously people need to appeal to it to appreciate it, but it's some of the work that I see some of these other people putting in that's kind of underappreciated or like the hours of content that's not actually watched. I do think that some people kind of deserve a bit more credit for the work that at least they're trying. I mean, we're in a somewhat dumpster fire of a profession, supposedly, and I guess things kind of seem to be crumbling by the at the seams, if that makes sense. But I do think that there are still people that are trying to solve it. I mean, even if that involves them taking their work directly out of the classroom. I do think there's some acknowledgement that needs to be had there. Second one is good old imposter syndrome. I think there's a lot I've learned about imposter syndrome, especially kind of, I feel like my imposter syndrome was kind of going away in my second full year because I was teaching all the same courses. I had a pretty good idea of the subject matter and this what the students needed to be successful in their examinations and what sports I kind of wanted to be involved in and kind of where I could help or at least be um, a part of. But then obviously moving away into a new everything, I feel like brought all the feelings back of like what am I actually doing? What's the goals here? What am I trying to accomplish? And seeking out reassurance, I think a lot in the earlier part of the year. But I heard this expression about again, kind of looking at how teaching differs, because I think if you are a if you are new in like law or medicine or even HR, any sort of profession, you're kind of not even onboarded for a long time, but you are like you're kind of working directly under someone in a lot of professions, I think. Again, for my own thought about medicine, it's kind of influenced by Grey's Anatomy and Suits for law, which I know is not a good thing, but I think even though so much of those shows are stories, I think what is true is like you kind of see the long process of what it takes to actually rise the uh, rise the ranks in those professions and how many years it takes and like who you're working under and like there's always kind of this authority in every situation that you can go to. But in teaching, it's like it's baptism by fire. Like you're kind of just thrown in, figure it out. Hopefully you've got some Kevlar on where that you don't get burned. I hope that's the right one for burning. I don't actually know, but think that is what is specific about teacher imposter syndrome is like you're kind of going through all these waves of change. You're kind of being told that you don't know what you're doing all the time, even though you have the same education as everyone else. And I know that a lot of education and learning in teaching comes through doing it. Even speaking with people that I know that are new principals are like, you know what, my first year being a principal, I was a fish out of water. I had no idea what I was doing. Year two, it's like, okay, like I'm kind of starting to get it. And then year three and four, it's like riding a bike and you're pretty good. But for imposter syndrome specifically, I think in a bit is kind of necessary. And I've reiterated this a lot of times, but in the lessons that I've had with guests on the show talking about imposter syndrome, it, I think two things are always clear. It's like if you don't have it, um, that's not normal, and you should not trust those who do not have imposter syndrome, which kind of feeds into what I was just saying that teachers should not have. Like again, you should say, you know what, I could be wrong, but this is what I've done, and it feels like it works, and this is why. So. I do think that's something about the imposter syndrome part for so lesson one, put yourselves out there more. Lesson two, imposter syndrome is normal, but it's also eerily specific to education for imposter syndrome because you kind of have this loss of guidance and this pressure to not seek guidance. I think that's an underrated part. I think even though everyone tells you that you're not supposed to know what you're doing in your first few years, it's still a fear of being incompetent when you're even asking people for help. So I know I learned a lot from a few of my closer friends about asking things with teaching, like obviously other people that were also teachers in the earlier stages, because once you kind of go to your principal for the sixth and seventh question of September, it's like, okay, maybe I'm being too much of a bother, even though they probably do feel appreciative for having you come to them too for those questions. Another one is, and sometimes these are a lot of points that I bring up with people because it's something that I kind of see to be true, and I guess they're typically reinforced by those that I talk to. The third claim I would say is new teachers should actually be involved in everything in their school, even though this time is unpaid. And what I mean by that is one thing that I really internalized at the end of my first year. I remember like my wife and I got married, and then it was my first year teaching. And there had not been a year in our relationship that I had not actually been working full time yet. Like I'd gone through university for 6 years while we were together. And it was hard in the sense of like, oh, I was like, I wanted to be involved in cross country. I wanted to be involved in football. I wanted to be involved. I helped out with basketball and for supervising. I helped out with track and field. I helped out with planning charity hockey games. I was just involved or was trying to be involved in as many things as I possibly could. There was like district social committee things. There was like Alberta committee things that I was a part of, and I don't regret any of those things, but again, when you're teaching all day and then you've got one practice till 4:30 and then another practice from 6 to 8 and then plus you've got all your essay marking and you're learning new content matter on top of that with no prep. I think that's something that's very daunting for a lot of people to take on. And obviously everything else that you're doing is it's not adding to your pay. And I find like I started to this podcast has never been something to come from like wanting to get paid for. I think it's just kind of a labor of love for the most part. But once I started reffing in my second year, I mean, I was kind of doing all the coaching things, starting to walk some things back, but then I was reffing hockey from 9 p.m. to 11 p.m. every night. I remember the first time I started reffing, I had 18 games in 23 days, and those were all around 9 to 10 p.m. So again, losing sleep, gaining weight, it was not pretty. Um, but I do think that you learn where you're not supposed to be. And I think like you kind of start to get a feeling of, you know what, in teaching, there are areas where I belong and there are areas where I do not. And for example, in my first year in New Brunswick, even though I've at times felt like I had no idea what I was doing on a teaching level in a resource position, in a position that's new to the province, which I've talked about ad nauseum on here, but I still was like, I want to be involved in cross country. I helped do Dungeons and Dragons, and I helped do volleyball and basketball and track and field and flag, like I think it's flag football, I might have said. Tried to do some ice hockey reffing here and kind of just being involved in everything. And I will say the commitment is much less intense at the middle school level, so I'll probably still do all the things next year, even though I'll have a new baby on the way because it's just not quite as intense as the high school demands are. Like there's very few games in the evening. And that's kind of the other part. It's like you feel like you need to be in attendance because you'll often hear like, oh, the students love to see the teachers in the stands for their games. That helps build relationships as well. I do think there are parts I do miss about like like I guess workaholism and just always trying to be a part of the school all the time. And there's also parts where I'm like kind of learning to take a breath and actually figure out what I'm doing rather than kind of having everything kind of come at me. I'm kind of walking toward things, which is a nice change. But I do think this is where, and I think when it comes to things like retention, I think where other professions give you so much time and literally like a hierarchically lower position that I believe classroom teachers should almost not even necessarily have a raise on the top end of the grid, because I know for the most part, like I think that things will start to happen with inflation. But I think the main point is, think if you paid first year teachers $20,000 more than they are right now, then they still max out at the same rate. So you're kind of starting that pay at a higher level at the beginning because new teachers are expected to be in everything because they're young. They are given classes that aren't necessarily ideal. Like they might teach like 7 different courses in junior high in the run of a year. They're trying to figure out who they are as a person in their career. They're trying to maybe find relationships. Maybe they're getting married. Maybe they're just starting a family. Like there's so many things that I think potentially take away, like even for myself, like I was definitely not financially struggling by any means, but then I was like, oh, now I can ref every night and get $50 a night for refing a hockey game. And I think again, if some of that is made up in the higher starting salary, I think you'll actually see a lot more comfortable engagement rather than this like sporadic chaos that's kind of embedded in a lot of first year teachers because you have a lot of those things. Like you don't have the honestly, and I don't even think this is even a tough ask for governments to actually consider because they're not actually paying people more on the max end. It's just kind of starting people at a higher one to actually retain teachers. Because I would like to actually do a study in the cost of teacher turnover and like what does it take for like what is the learning loss of actually training a new teacher in your school every year if people are constantly trying to move around and potentially even leave the profession. So I think that cost is actually relatively minimal compared to if we just kind of started teachers at a higher salary at the beginning and help them a little bit more while they're trying to figure out who they actually are as a teacher and kind of giving them the permission to say like, you know what, you can still go on that trip this summer if you want, but then still do 8 extracurricular activities rather than oh, I'll just do one or two and try to avoid kind of doing other things because I'm actually working a part-time job on Friday night and I'm actually still bartending on Friday and Saturday. So I think that if that's something that we can consider as like, you know what, we understand that maybe lawyers and doctors should be paid more than teachers in on the later stages of their career, which I totally understand, but maybe as a way to offset some of that immediate disillusionment is a little bit of a financial incentive or a boost, if you will, at the beginning of careers. Another truth, so that's the first three. I would say the imposter syndrome and the baptism by fire and how it's specific to teaching. You've got new teachers should actually be involved in everything. So I think you need to learn where you don't belong. And the first one being that teachers need to be less humble and put themselves out there more and actually not be afraid to share their expertise and not made to be feel weird by other teachers when trying to share their expertise because they're we are all learning different things in our classrooms every day and the fear of not trying to look like you actually know what you're doing in a profession that worships not knowing what you're doing, I think is something that could be certainly weeded out. The number four, I would say, is you can actually feel the energy of a school the moment you walk in, and your gut instinct is usually correct. There are better schools than others, and there are some teachers that you should model more than others, and this does not have to be a bad thing. I think school culture is arguably the cheesiest topic. Whenever I go into a PD session, they're like, you just gotta be positive and like and welcoming and smile at your kids as they walk through the door. And it's like I understand that all these things have a good place, and but I do think, and I think especially with Haley Chisholm in the episode recently, but I've talked about it a few times. Like when I was substitute teaching, I mean, shout out Fort Max, only 5 high schools there, but I subbed in all the high schools, and there were some I would walk into, and it just like the air feels heavy. I'm not gonna get into any like woo woo fantasy energy stuff here, but it's undeniable. Everyone says it's true. So I think there's a degree to which that it is true in my own experience. And actually was thinking about this when I walked into my new school here in New Brunswick. And I've been there, I'm staying there next year. I mean, I guess first time I'm saying that mm, in the same role. And that'll be more on that in the Clarke notes at the end of the month. There's a way that you're welcomed. And I don't know if it has to do with like the architecture of the opening of a class or of a school. I don't know if it's a Windows thing, if it's like, does it feel like a prison in here? I don't know what that is necessarily, but I think there's in what ways are you potentially cast aside upon immediately walking into a building? Like there's some buildings I've walked into and like obviously you're new to this place, so you're kind of like, oh, like you're kind of giving people nods and doing like the like you're just trying to be friendly and kind of open and just kind of like, oh hey, like where can I find the office here? And people are like oh, it's just down there. Like I think it's and that could just again be influenced by your own kind of need to be seen. That could be the case, but it does seem to be, and I don't even really know what there is to learn a lesson from this, but I guess I would say if you have the opportunity to do some subbing in a district that you want to teach in, I think, like for example, if you finish your degree in April and now you've got May and June to sub in that district as a teacher, if someone offers you like a 2 month placement, I might feel like, oh yeah, like I want to get that 2 months in right away. Unless you like maybe you do your practicum at a school and you get an offer at that school, which I did, which I wanted, and I wanted to stay there. But I do think that there's something to be said about going because even I know teachers that are like, oh, you know what? I wanted to teach grade two or what have you. And I subbed at this school. It was junior high and I loved it. Like I loved the staff. The principals were all great. There's no micromanaging and like this is a place that I want to be and the teaching will find itself. I think that's um an underrated way. I don't know how you change the feel of your school the second you walk in. Maybe that's a conversation for another day with a school culture, maybe aficionado or expert. I wouldn't even know how you studied that, but I think it's something that I've noticed myself, and I've been like, is this a weird thing to bring up? You can't really just go into the first person you say, like, do you feel weird when you walk in here? Like, I get that. Like, that's, you're gonna come off as a crazy person. You'll say, like, you know what, don't hire that person. But it is true. And I remember there was actually a few teachers at my old school that would say to me when they would walk into my classroom, they were like I just feel so light in here. And I don't know, maybe that's because I get to teach social studies and it's not that stressful, but I do think that there is something to the ways that we welcome and design people and design our spaces for people that speaks a lot more than we think it does. So yeah, the emotional resonance and response to walking into a school. I think that's also kind of leads into a secondary point on this is that I heard of a term called emotional contagion. And this is kind of on the same thread where it says emotional contagion is a phenomenon where emotions, behaviors, and even moods spread from one person to another, often unconsciously. I know, for example, when you're married to someone for been together for almost 10 years now, like there's times where like I'll be in a good mood and maybe she's in a horrible mood, or I'm in a horrible mood and she's in a great mood, and we almost kind of like level to each other's spot. And that's something I think obviously you can tell that when you're in a relationship with almost anyone. And obviously if you encounter someone who's like super pissed off, like you probably won't get angry yourself, but you also understand that you're not about to have a joyful conversation. Like you kind of understand that social cue. But one thing I've always thought was funny in talking to anyone is that whenever the staff room conversation comes up, even the people that eat there don't really like it, which is I thought was kind of hilarious. Like I know, for example, I've never been someone who likes to eat in the staff room because I kind of like my time by myself. I think that even someone who does a podcast and has a very social job in teaching and talking with kids and adults and teachers all the time. I mean, the second I get home, I like to just walk by myself and I like to have a lot of time by myself. And I think like that 40 minutes at lunchtime, like I almost consider that as like weirdly sacred silent time. Like, no, like I also eat very loud food. I eat apples and pretzels every day. So it's like eating that in the staff room is pretty aggressive anyway. And a protein shake. So you're shaking, like I'm crunching. Like it's just not a pretty sight to be around. But I've never felt good going back to class after eating lunch in the staff room. That's kind of always been it's like another 40 minutes of like forced conversation. Again, like I've always worked with good people. That's never been the issue. But even like when I moved to New Brunswick, I was like, you know what? Like, no, I'm gonna eat in the staff room. I'm gonna be different this year. And like a month in, I was like, you know, I like just chilling by myself. I mean, they're all great people. Love all you guys at Beak, but I don't know. I just for some reason, and again, that's kind of across the board. I think a lot of teachers are like, you know what? I want to close my door. I think the again, you have this like weird emotional contagion of the way the students feel when they come to school in the morning from their own homes coming into your classroom. You're taking all that on to respond to them, then you're taking all that to your staff room and kind of all feeding into this like emotional chaos. Again, usually unwittingly. Um, but I think on your average day, like obviously I love big staff meals and coffee and donuts are coming and you're socializing in the staff room. That's a different thing. But I think when it comes to the routine of it, it's something I've definitely tried to avoid, which is also something I thought was hilarious that other teachers notice themselves. My wife also doesn't like to eat in her staff room at her schools ever. So I don't know if maybe that's just what we've discovered, but the first five, I guess I would say, or kind of add on those last two, the emotional contagion of people hate the staff room for whatever reason, which I think is hilarious. And the way the schools feel when you walk in every day is also, um, I think it's a weird one because I don't really believe in like a lot of this energy type stuff, but I do think in that regard it's almost undeniable. It almost feels like you're walking like I guess if you can kind of picture walking into a hospital or walking into a dentist office or walking into a vet clinic, you have a feeling associated with that walking in. So, and people might have a different, like, I guess how I feel when I walk into my school is like preparing for, I don't even really have like preparing for the day. Like, it doesn't feel like stressful, if you will. So, I don't know what causes that. Um, I'm sure the people involved in whatever school you're in definitely play a role in the way people feel about walking into that building. The next one, to kind of get to more of a technical side, is I fear that we hear a lot of rhetoric about need more funding for education. We need, but there's never, I guess, given a what does the ideal funded system look like? Is it is it one support teacher per 75 students? Is it one? Is it a 1 to 20 ratio? Is it simply just the class cap sizes, but then like do we cap classes at 23, but then lower teacher salary by 15%, or we give it a 33 student limit, but then we raise teacher salary by 11%? It's it always differs from context to context, but I think having too loose of a definition of what a quote unquote fully funded education system looks like. I'm just thinking of this right now on the top of my head. I think one of the highest funded provinces um, in Canada is Quebec, but they're kind of notorious for this year having like I think 8,500 or 6,800, I think, unfilled teaching positions. So it's like, what does that fully funded part actually mean? And for example, I remember speaking with someone here in the district, in my new district, and they would say, "Oh, like why would you leave Alberta? Like it's such a don't they have like a fully funded like maximally funded system?" And my response was like, you know what, New Brunswick, it's not a secret that when you, I mean, I think my school was built in 1896, a piece built on in 1920, and now the part that we work in now is built in the 50s, and obviously had some renos over time, but it's like okay, yes, the buildings here are older, but we have our classes capped at 29. And they got a 15% raise last year over the course of a 3-year period in their next collective agreement. I mean, Alberta committed like an accelerated education fund for to build new schools for almost $10 billion. But again, my wife said that she knows people who are teaching kindergarten classes of 26 and 27. So it's like, what do you care more about? Which is probably the nature of what it means for a fully funded system, no matter where you are. But I do think it's very interesting to kind of get into this comparison lens where what does it mean to be fully funded to your province? I think even having Selena Fisk on talking about like what data should your district track, and she's like, it really starts with what you want. Do we care more about the learning experience? Do we care more about teacher support? Do we care about trying to minimize the ratio of student to teacher as much as possible? Do you try to make it a 1 to 20 ratio, or do you make it a 1 to 30 ratio, but then you try to hire more support teachers for more intensive intervention? I will say personally, teaching summer school for a few years. there was a split that we did where one summer I did no essay marking, and they actually hired someone like to do the marking for the class, and I just taught the class. So, I mean, I had a class of 25, but I just got to lead discussion about social studies every day, and it was awesome. Like I would show up at 8 a.m., we would work till 1:30, and it was just grinding through content, watching some videos, going through the lessons, and saying, you know what, like, here's your essay preparation day. They would write the essays, someone else would mark it, which was awesome. The year after, again, like you're paying two people the same amount, we had classes of 12 and 13, but I did my own essay marking and they did their own essay marking. So to me, it's like I actually enjoyed having more students in my class for the teaching part. So kind of you can do a bit more, I think, with driving some discussion, unless you're doing like a seminar course or something, which I never did teach. I think there's more to it than just having this class size cap. It's what is the what is the target of each teacher and what are they trying to accomplish, and how can you set up people in your building to offset responsibilities and actually make it easier for everyone, like a mutually beneficial teaching relationship, which I think is something that could be explored a bit more. Um, but yes, I think this lack of a perception of fully funded education, what it means to have a definitively fully funded system is, I guess, one of the questions I'd always ask is like, oh, if you had unlimited spending, how would you improve your education system? Think realistically, like no one's saying, oh, like pay teachers $200,000 a year. It's like, oh no, like you would have maybe like a 15, like a 10 to 12% kind of raise to adjust over the inflation over the past decade, and like a clause in there to kind of raise by 2% each year where there's an agreement made. Like I think it's actually seriously simple, the things that we actually want to kind of solve. But then you hear things where education spending per student does not actually equate with better learning outcomes. Again, this is, I think, an area that I want to explore more in my master's as that kind of comes down the road here in a couple of years. Like, how do you actually, what is the best way to use money for learning? I think that's the most fundamental question that we're all trying to figure out. I mean, is it paying? Is it really the, oh no, like don't take the surgeon that wants to make four and $500,000 a year and do 15 years of school. Maybe they want to go into education if they can make more money and be a teacher instead. Is that the answer? I don't think so, but it's something to be considered of the big, yeah. So yeah, fully funded systems. No one really has a, like people are almost too scared to answer the question of like, what would you do with fully funded? I mean, I think like, again, having friends that are teaching courses with 41 and 42 in junior high, I think it just doesn't even make sense. I think having I think no more than 30. I think 30 is your cutoff. I feel like kindergarten, no more than 20, even 18. And then junior high, 25, high school, 30. I think that kind of keeps things a bit more manageable. Again, you're kind of escalating the level of students versus the behaviors that you see. And again, even now, I think it's weird that we, like, I'm trying to think of who I knew in high school that had like an individualized plan. And then, like, now you, like, and like individualized planning can also start to lose its merit once you have a class of 30 and 28 of them have individualized plans. Like there's a time where you start to, it's almost like the concept creep where things like kind of start to lose their meaning the more that they're used. Um, but again, that's a maybe a conversation for another day. The next one I would say is standardization needs to mean something to be effective, but students will find loopholes with everything we do. I don't know if I would get in trouble for saying this or not, but like I remember having students who would come up to me and say, "Oh, like we wrote our diploma exam, but we did it on Google Docs." And so I found a way to log into Google Docs on my phone in the bathroom, use ChatGPT to email it to myself on my exam email and put it onto my paper. And then when you mark diploma exams in Alberta, you you just get a piece of paper with their exam. You know nothing about the student. You don't know where they came from, which definitely has its merit. But because it meant something more and actually had an effect on their mark, students will find any way to cheat on it. So, is there a better way than just simply writing something down, as we know can be, I think, arguably poisoned by ChatGPT? Obviously, a lot of benefit to AI. I'm not going to be the one to sit here and derogate that. But when it comes to, I think even in the future, if I teach any sort of social or humanities course, I think that public speaking, doing projects like what I'm, I guess, doing right now, I know that I have lots of areas for improvement. I say like and and but and I guess I don't know how many times, but there's definitely things that I think students can improve on that you can't necessarily just assess with writing anymore, which I think is sad because I think um, writing is still very important. I think my fear of writing still is very strong, and I think trying to overcome and develop your own processes for doing that is still important. And like I think even, for example, the different people in different provinces that I've spoken to, it's like, oh, like we do standardized tests, but it's just like a grade 8 one for science, and they kind of just write it. Like we don't really put a whole lot of thought into it. But then like we don't put a whole lot of thought into the preparation for it, but then like departments still use this information from these assessments that's not really given a lot of thought to make major decisions. And then I guess in Alberta is kind of the other side where the decision is made to make these standardized tests so important. So people kind of dedicate all of their teaching to these standardized tests, which is also maybe the other extremes. I don't know. I mean, I think it's good to have standards. I don't know necessarily what that means for, like, do you do a Canada-wide test? I don't know. Maybe that's not the right route either. But I think if you are trying to look for optional things that students can take to kind of be a bit more competitive, I think that's still the nature of education is students are competing rather than collaborating. But I don't really know what the answer is to that, but I do feel that I've learned that standardization is a lot murkier. And I think the ones that say that standardization is everything do not understand the extent to which that students can actually loophole themselves around getting the higher grade when the grade is all that matters on those standardized tests. And I think on the other side where people or would argue that standardization is actually less effective. And even if we do them, it shouldn't like you shouldn't teach to the test, but then the information from those assessments are still being used to make major decisions. So that's a weird split. I mean, I don't, there's got to be something in the middle there that we can kind of be like, no, like we do the like literacy and math ones same time every year, every grade. Maybe that's something you do, but that's all you do. I think that could be like maybe during exam period at the end of January or end of January every year. Middle schoolers, elementary students, everyone does just literacy and numeracy, but every year. And that's the standard for kind of like, you know what? How are students progressing from year to year? Um, what are they losing? I don't know. Like, I think there's something to kind of not make it as scattered and random and like we're testing all these different things where it's like maybe you actually make it a lot simpler than it needs to be. Um, but yeah, the standardization is definitely a weird one. I feel like this got something for myself too. I think that like I even spoke with I think Mark Williams and like Bernie Godwin, a lot of like respected people that are discussing things involved with neuroscience in education. But feel like it's starting to fall on deaf ears, meaning like when I first got into teaching, it's like, oh, it was trauma informed practice. And I would say the core component that I took from trauma informed practice was to not yell at my students. Like my number one goal, I think, from the beginning is I do not want to yell at my students to discipline them. And I think all that's really given me, if I'm being completely honest, is a label of, oh, you're too nice or too chill, and we can walk all over you. I mean, I think the yelling is the boundary still. I think like good classroom management is often just rewarded as those who are a bit more just traditionally disciplinarian with their students. And again, it's like we call it good learning, but then all the teachers say that they hate that teacher. So it's like, I don't know if we've actually made progress on that. And again, that's kind of me speaking from my own experience. Um, but I do think that the applicability of neuroscience in education, like to me, I think the second someone says anything regarding, well, and this is what happens in the brain, I think the expression in the brain is like people still don't even really know how the brain works. Like I know, like again, I've listened to probably 100 hours of some of the top neuroscientists in human lab. I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I know how the brain works, and I'm sure there are things that we do know for certain, but in terms of like how the brain works, I think we have overused that so much that I think and I don't even really know how it's like I think realistically what it's tried to bring into education is a emphasis on calming our nervous system. Again, that's kind of another classic cliche phrase. Um, Trying to be calm. And I don't really know how calm you can make a middle school student, if I'm being completely honest. Like, I just feel a lot of the neuroscience and stuff that, like, I think, for example, which I think is sad, and I could be wrong, and I hope I'm wrong. Like, I think that I could go do a 2-year master's program in neuroscience and for learning in education and come out of it with actually not knowing anything different of how I would actually have a relationship with any student. So, like, I don't even know what it would actually serve me in doing, other than just knowing a bit more about how trauma affects the individual, which I feel like is pretty common discussion, I think, in any sort of popular culture right now. But I think, unfortunately, like, again, the second we have a PD speaker that's talking to us about trauma-informed practice or burnout, I think, I think that teachers that have outside passions, again, this is kind of being one for me, are the ones who do not get burned out. Like the ones who, uh, I like to go for walks, and I like to do podcasts, and I like to listen to podcasts. I would say I'm a very high consumer of podcasts as well. And I like to read. I have things that I'm interested in outside of teaching specifically, which I feel like doesn't make me think constantly about teaching. I think that was true even when I was a classroom teacher. Like I think my second year of teaching, I think my teaching was genuinely better, like in the classroom. I think my meeting of deadlines was worse. But I think my actual teaching in the classroom was definitely better than my first year in terms of like my quality of instruction. And I guess the goals of each day and each lesson. Obviously, some days when I would ref at 11 p.m., I'd be maybe a couple more videos than I should have played. But all that is to say, I don't know if anything about the polyvagal theory, um, or burnout or trauma-informed practice has really actually, and then maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm speaking too harshly of. I think it's maybe just a frustration of like I want to be able to help my students more that are actually experiencing those issues, but I don't know how to. Even though, like I said, I mean, I create this kind of like hopefully PD and talk to those guests about these things all the time. And I do often feel like it feels way more theoretical than practical. And maybe that is just the nature of it. Maybe that is just the nature of discussing how these things about how neuroscience and all these things do apply to education specifically. The next one I would say is that teachers do not want others to know they use AI because it makes them appear lazy. I would say even if it is more effective, and this is something I've had a conversation with my wife about, 'cause we're both teachers, and hopefully we're both not bad ones. I think she's a much better teacher than I, but I've had moments where it's like, you know what? Like I spent Saturday morning marking all my essays and getting my grade book updated and like, my Google Classroom's up to date. Like I kind of know where I'm going this week, like with my planning. And but you still feel like you're not allowed to say that. You feel like if I tell you that as a teacher, I am actually pretty caught up on things and I'm prepared for this week. So for example, I was talking to someone, just happened to be walking with someone who I had just met, and it was an older teacher, and I was like, no, like I feel pretty good, but the I think what they explicitly said to me was, if a teacher feels like they have nothing else to do, they are either delusional or incompetent or both. And I'm like, okay, well then there's no wonder no one wants to do this anymore. Because if you feel like you have to be working 12 hours a day or 15 hours a day to be effective, not perfect, 'cause perfection doesn't exist, but to just be effective, I felt like immediately though, my thought was, okay, I never want to speak to this person again, which I think is hilarious because like I just don't understand this holier than thou mentality that some people would have about like, no, if you don't know what you're doing, that's because you're incompetent. Like I think it comes off very like sticking your nose up almost to this weird position of superiority. That like, no, you work more, so that means you have a right to appear a proper word. Like you have a right to hold yourself higher. I don't really know, but that's kind of the when I got that impression, it's like, like there are times it's okay to say that you're not drowning. I think it's almost a weird peer pressure to say like, oh no, I remember I kind of learned some ways to kind of cut down my like I would mark essays from I think there was one Saturday in my first year. I woke up at 7 a.m. I was like, what, I'm gonna get these done today. And like it was written feedback on all my essays. It was like returning them to my students, giving them a mark, looking at the rubric, and finish at 5:30 p.m. That's 10 hours, and I'm like, what did I actually accomplish today? So I started to actually say, you know what, I'm gonna read through all these, kind of like in diploma marking in Alberta. I'm gonna read through all these, I'm gonna assess them, I'm gonna use in-class time for peer reviews of their own papers with students, and I'm gonna sit down with students one-on-one to give feedback in class. Like to me, the amount of time that you can save by trying to, I don't even necessarily believe like you have to give all the student learning responsibility to the students because like I'm still their teacher. It's still my responsibility and my job to actually impart this feedback for improving on them. But this idea that you just need to hate every moment of every day to be an effective teacher, I think is honestly annoying. And I think it deters everyone from trying to actually be open about, because I think once you say that, like, oh, I'm already drowning, then you don't actually have room to ask proper questions for what you can improve on. Because it's the assumption like, I don't want to help you with your problems because I already have all my own drowning problems myself. So, yeah, I think that, um, especially when it comes to using AI specifically, it's like, yeah, like not too long ago, I was helping a kid with place value. I ran through a lesson on ChatGPT and Magic School AI to try to find some quick lessons and quick worksheets, and I was like, oh, this is great. But in a weird way, it's like you don't want people to know that you're doing it, but like, why? Why does that need to be such a weird thing? Why do tools that help teachers save their time need to be demonized? It does not make sense to me. But yeah, and even if it's more effective. So yeah, that the whole story of like the incompetence or delusional, I'm like, okay. I was like, all right, you have a great day. See you later. I think that also kind of comes back to my earlier point about like newer teachers actually kind of want to be told what to do. Like I want a veteran teacher to be like, hey, I used to stay up till 11 p.m. making a worksheet for my students, but Magic School AI made this exact same one that I tinkered for 3 minutes with in like 10 seconds. So I just do think that there needs to be a bit more of this common collaboration of not even shortcuts, but the more efficient ways that teachers have actually learned to do things in everything. So I think there's still a lot of tediousness. Maybe we can talk about report cards, another one. I still think that they don't even make sense to me anymore, why we still do them and spend 80 hours a year. I mean, you're talking about if we had 80 more hours a year to plan our lessons and um, invest in our quality of work, I I think the learning outcomes will be a lot better than the time spent just simply doing report cards. But that maybe that makes too much sense. The last one that I'll talk about for today, as I know I'm gearing up near an hour, is that I think being in a position where I kind of exist on, and not even just I, but people that work on resource teams and administration, there's always this narrative that like, oh, they don't do anything or they're useless, they just sit at their desk and blah blah blah. Like I know even some with my own position at another school, we were talking with the ASTs at their school, and they're like, oh, the AST in my school is useless. And I'm like, and there is a lot of and there were comments made to me this year in my own building, which I won't redress here, but just like openly talking smack to someone's face about them not doing anything. I think first of all, it's just kind of crazy, but not the way to make friends, I don't think. But seeing like, I think there's a lot more micro decisions you have to make as a teacher responsively every day that you come into contact with in your classroom. Then maybe, and again, I don't do any admin work myself, obviously, so I won't speak on anyone's behalf, but I do think that there's so much more weight in every decision that is made. I I remember talking to a principal from Red Deer, and he said he's like I had to give it up after a couple of years because I he's like my blood pressure was getting too high, and my doctor actually told me to stop. So like I'm just trying to think of the actual wear and tear on the body of our administrators and what they actually give up. And even talking to I think Dr. Ken Breen not too long ago about like you can't go into administration for the pay bump. I think teachers are like looking for a way to get out of the classroom after a while and still stay in education. I think if administration is your goal, um, you really don't actually get paid more because you take on so much more responsibility and time after school with like meetings and parents and extracurriculars that it does not actually equate with a raise. But it's something that's kind of been, I would say, a bit more I've become a bit more empathetic with is this idea that administrators are actually giving up so much more than we think. And again, this can sound super ass kissy, but I think when it comes down to the one or two unpleasant interactions that you have as a teacher with parents maybe per year, that obviously negativity bias, that's going to stick with you a lot more than your positive ones, that like principals and vice principals are just dealing with such heavy things. And I think, and in that conversation with Dr. Ken Breen, we talked about this as well. Like so much is being shielded from teachers about what's actually going on with the students in their personal lives that, and that's their burden to carry. So I think that if that's something like personally, I don't think I could see myself ever doing it. I think administration, it just feels thankless. And I feel like you potential my principal even this year jokes like you guys don't have to be quiet when I walk into the staff room, like I think you give up so much of your potentially like, peer satisfaction and taking on that leadership role in a school that I just don't know if not even that it's not worth it because maybe you are like you're setting the tone, you're making sure everyone's taken care of, but I think it can definitely be, I think you need to have a certain personality to do it, and I don't think it's mine. I think I'm still a little bit too aloof, and maybe just inexperienced and delusional and incompetent to be ever considered for a role like that. But yeah, I do have a few more on here, but I think I will save those for the Clark notes here at the end of the month. Think to wrap up here, I just want to say thank you. I know that obviously it's not hard to see that this show doesn't get millions of views, but I do I do genuinely think that I do appreciate everyone who does take the time to listen. Um, I know that I'm hoping the future of the show continues to just kind of wherever it goes, I'm happy with. I love kind of sitting down, talking about education related things for an hour on a Sunday morning here again, as normal people do. But yeah, Thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoyed episode 101 of the lessons I've learned from my first 2 years and 100 episodes of doing Mr. Clarke After Dark. And I would say maybe one day I'll hit 1,000. Maybe that's my new goal is 1,000 episodes for Mr. Clarke After Dark. But yeah. I got two more episodes coming out this month. There will be one with actually a former student of mine. So it'll be the first former student on the podcast as an appearance. And then one more Clark Notes episode for the end of the month, which I'll go into a bit more about what the plans are for the summer and the fall and kind of what the future looks like a bit for Mr. Clarke After Dark. All right. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for listening.